This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot Sunday School, the weekend haggis and neeps for those of you still feeling peckish after our regular midweek banquet. I'm Naomi.
And I'm Kenny, your literal embodiment of quiet riot haggis and neeps. Indigestion, always a risk, I'm afraid.
You just got back from Scotland. We've missed you in the studio. How was bonny Scotland?
It was wet. I went up there and it was wet, traditionally Scottish wet. And when I drove down at the beginning of the week, I got 3 miles south of Gretna Green. I literally couldn't see the mountains in Glencoe. If there's any hill walkers amongst our audience, you'll know that the Annaheagach Ridge in Glencoe is a big, scary ridge. The clouds were so low I could barely see the road. It was ridiculous. 3 miles south of Gretna Green, it wasn't just that the weather changed, the entire damn climate changed. Sunshine, birds singing, people running about in T-shirts. So,
sun shines on the righteous, Kenny.
Yeah, also shines in Cumbria. Make what you will of that. So I was down to Cumbria on Tuesday, then down to Bristol, then down to the Exeter part of the world, then over to London yesterday, back to Devon today, and I am a big, sweaty blob after all that. And I picked the hottest week of the year to do it. So,
Kenny.
What a clod. What a clod. Never mind.
Well, what we're going to talk about today, as we record this, the assisted dying bill has just passed, and the now published welfare reform bill is there for dissection. But both of those being such big, chunky topics, I think, should we leave those for another day?
Agreed. They're way too big for a Sunday.
Yeah, we'll give them space to be fully chatted through. So I thought maybe we could make mention of it being 9 years, almost to the day, since that fateful referendum on EU membership.
9 years. I mean, 9 years. I genuinely can't believe that we'll have had a decade of this madness by next June. And speaking of which, I'd like to discuss the state of UK universities, because there's been another spate of worrying news for one of our most prized exports as well.
Okay, well, I'm always up for talking about higher education and its benefit and crisis. Obviously, all of this is happening against the backdrop of Iran and Israel. So actually, before I spoke to you, I hopped on a call with Arthur. So we'll pop that in somewhere too and give listeners the wisdom of his thoughts on everything Middle East.
Nice one, Naomi. And listeners, if that all whets your appetite for a bit more, don't forget to bang a few quid our way at ko-fi.com/quietriotpod so we can keep bringing you this kind of content.
And look, someone's got to keep Alexandreo in his gold pajamas. But if money's tight, you can help him out in other ways. Share an episode with a friend who you think might like it, because it'll help us reach new ears, and you can do that for free. And it really, really does make a big difference to us. So thank you.
Alex in his gold pajamas. I'm off to bleach my eyes. Let's crack on.
I've caught up with foreign policy expert and host of the brilliant Behind the Lines podcast, Arthur Snell, to ask him everything about the conflict between Iran and Israel and everything that you might have been too afraid to ask, things that you think you maybe should know the answer to, as well as the stuff that probably no one has got the answer to. So he talked me through the timing of the attacks, the risk to the UK and maybe even Cyprus if we get involved, what the USA is pushing for, and what Israel's real objectives might be, and whether we can expect regime change in Tehran anytime soon. Have a listen. Arthur, thanks for joining us on the show again.
No problem.
It is genuinely difficult to know just how to handle this segment of the show, because everything could be outdated in minutes, let alone in the 48 hours it is between me talking to you and when Sunday school actually goes out. So I'd really appreciate it if we could go back to basics,
Yeah.
for those much less familiar with Iran than maybe Israel-Palestine. Who is technically allied with Iran, like Hezbollah, and who, until recently at least, had maybe a kind of working transactional trading relationship with them? I'm thinking probably some European countries on oil.
In terms of Iran's sort of direct allies, obviously there's the so-called axis of resistance, which at one point one would think of Iran, Syria under Bashar al-Assad, and then of course Iran and Russia have been close. Iran supplying Russia with drones during the Ukraine war. Now, obviously, a lot of Iran's closer allies have fallen away, and there's no way not to conclude that Iran has lost a lot of its closer allies. Clearly, Assad is now in Moscow, Hezbollah is on its knees, as are the various other proxies that Iran has around the Middle East region. In terms of that more kind of pragmatic rub along, yes, quite a lot of European countries found ways to work with Iran. But to be very honest with you, that got harder and harder, because even though under the JCPOA, the Obama era nuclear deal, there was sanctions lift, a lot of American financial institutions continue to make it very difficult. So you'd have European companies completely legally under international law trading with Iran, but then finding it very difficult to get their payments through.
Right.
So Iran has been pretty isolated in recent years.
What was meant to be happening with regards to diplomatic talks with Iran, and like when were they meant to happen? Give us a timetable leading up to the Israeli attack.
I mean, that's really interesting, because the Americans were in direct talks taking place in Oman, and Oman has always acted as the intermediary. And I guess you could say that's another kind of ally of Iran, although obviously also very close to Western countries. So you had Steve Witkoff meeting the Iranians. They were, ironically enough, renegotiating pretty much the JCPOA. So the same deal that Trump said was...
Remind us what JCPOA says.
Yeah, so this was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This was the Obama-era nuclear deal, the one that Trump said was the worst deal of the century, and he was just about to renegotiate pretty much the same deal. And then the Israelis struck. And I think the Iranians were certainly taken by surprise, and it's not clear whether or not the Americans were as well. And I think we'll be asking that question.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to pick your brains with the what and then the when. So on the what, how much do you think was based on actual intelligence versus opportunism? And as you said, here is Iran pretty isolated now, many of its allies already diminished, defeated, other, certainly subdued. You know the intelligence world better than most. We know that there were Mossad operatives acting out of Tehran, but what would you reckon the balance was of straight up intelligence, these guys are close to having a nuclear warhead, versus no matter how far along they are, now is a great time to strike before any deal gets signed, any new plan of action, and while their allies are weakened?
So I would say it's one part intelligence, two parts opportunism. So the intelligence is, yes, that Iran, thanks to Donald Trump pulling out of that nuclear deal, accelerated its uranium enrichment, and it was certainly getting close to the point where it might have been able to put together a nuclear weapon. Having said that, US intelligence was still saying it would be a couple more years. The Israelis were saying it was imminent. So, maybe the truth is somewhere between the two of those. So that's the intel bit. Now, as you rightly noted, Naomi, the Mossad have got an extraordinary level of infiltration of all elements of the Iranian regime, which speaks volumes in itself. And so there may be other things that they knew, maybe tensions within the leadership. But in terms of specifically around the nukes, I think that's where we were at. In terms of opportunism, I think there are two factors there. One is, yes, these negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians actually were making a bit of progress. So I think the Israelis had a desire to disrupt those negotiations. And then the other opportunism is, frankly, Bibi Netanyahu needs to keep wars going. Otherwise, he faces a domestic political crisis. And that he's doing that with Gaza, and he's now doing it with Iran.
And on the when, I mean, we've all read and laughed about the pizza delivery orders around the Pentagon going through the roof late into the night last week. But do you think the Israeli strike was better planned by them and their allies than the surprise many in the media took it to be? And I'm thinking like Saudi increased oil production a month ago. Is it feasible that they knew about it as an ally of the US?
Yeah, there are lots of these intriguing indicators. If you look back just in the sort of quality press, New York Times, things like that, there was talk about this sort of increasing pressure from Netanyahu that he said, I'm going to launch an attack. So there was a sense that something was in the pipeline, but the idea of exactly when was perhaps not known about. Now, whether or not specific individuals in the US system knew, I think, again, is one of those questions we just can't answer at this point. The impression I have is that Trump probably didn't know because he was quite excited about his big deal that he was going to make with Iran. And he's now talking as if that wasn't even, he's sort of conveniently forgotten about that. So that because it's frankly quite embarrassing for him.
Well, indeed.
That he was at that point, and then his so-called allies launched a war.
Whereas Putin in all of this, I mean, pretending he might be some sage intermediary, we know, but will he be enjoying all of this? We're possibly looking at oil price disruptions. Do they help or hinder his ambitions in Ukraine and anywhere else he may have an eye on?
It's interesting because Iran, as I said, is one of their few allies is Russia, and they've helped them with weapons supplies, particularly these Shahid drones. Having said that, I think I'm right in saying that the Russians have started manufacturing the drones themselves, and it's a very simple drone, so it's not that it's some unique technology. I would imagine that for someone as cynical as Putin, he can sort of take the advantages, as you say, oil prices going up, an opportunity to grandstand on the world stage as a sort of sage peacemaker, and frankly a diversion of attention. I mean, America, well, the Trump administration, I should say, has more or less decided to give up on Ukraine anyway, but clearly this diverts even more attention away from it. So I don't think there are many downsides for Putin. I suppose the only one might be that it doesn't look like you get much advantage from being an ally of Russia. You look at Syria, you now look at Iran. It's hard to see what being Russia's ally does for you. So I think,
to the table,
yeah, exactly. So it's in the long term, it might undermine some of Russia's other alliances, but I think Putin is probably cynical enough that he can live with that.
Well, let's get on to then Ukraine in the context of European NATO allies potentially being dragged into more Middle East conflict. And we may well see pressure from the US, and we'll talk specifically about the UK in a minute, but is there a situation where the US is trying to put pressure on Europe to say, get involved, meaning that NATO allies could turn around and go, we're kind of busy with Ukraine right now, but if you're willing to provide security guarantees there, we could get a lot more involved with the war you're doing?
That would be a neat bit of sort of negotiating, the kind of thing one might imagine someone like Macron might be able to pull off. I think realistically, though, that there isn't really much that even if Europeans had an interest in doing so, and I think most would want to steer very clear for all kinds of reasons, there isn't much of a role for Europeans to play. You've got the Israelis already there. The Americans bring certain specific capabilities, especially these famous bunker buster bombs, where there's no European that has that capability. So I'm not really sure that there would be much for us to bring to the party.
Obviously the risk is for Britain, right?
Yes.
There's a lot. Now, this is a bit that will probably date between us recording it late on Thursday and this going out on Sunday. But what is the risk to Brits supporting Israel and America, even if we don't send actual weapons, if we give them the access in Chagos that they're after? Cyprus is obviously right on the doorstep. I mean, TikTok is already on fire with creators telling British people to cancel their holidays to Cyprus.
I knew we'd be talking about this, and so I actually consulted an eminent KC, Sean Wilkin, who's a barrister, knows international law and worked in government and outside as well. There seems to have been, I think, probably from a number 10 briefing, which may have been deliberate to sort of throw people off track, or may have been a mistake. This idea that somehow the Americans would seek permission from us to use Diego Garcia to bomb Iran. Now,
we already share it, right?
Well, the point about it is that they have a sort of long-term tenancy, and it's rather like someone sort of calling up, a landlord calling up their tenant and saying, well, I'm afraid you can't cook risotto on a Thursday. It doesn't work like that. They control Diego Garcia, and they're allowed to do what they want with it. And so if they decide to launch an attack on Iran from Diego Garcia, there is no permission that they need to seek from the UK to be able to do that. Like I say, there seems to be some kind of a misunderstanding. I mean, it's reported in The Guardian that, number 10 would need to give permission. And that, as far as I can tell, that is just simply not correct.
And with regards to Cyprus, and forgive me, I really do not understand rockets and missiles and drones and how far they can go and things like that. But we've seen people on Cyprus beaches that face east filming the Iranian rockets falling on Tel Aviv. You can see it from there.
Yeah.
The UK obviously controls some significant parts of Cypriot land with military bases there.
Yeah.
If it is seen by Iran to be facilitating US and Israeli attacks, is it feasible that Iran, maybe via Beirut, could launch some kind of preemptive strike on military bases that the Brits control in Cyprus?
Yes, basically. And they wouldn't even need to go via Beirut. Iran's, they have quite a sophisticated arsenal of missiles, including ones that could reach that far. Now, before everyone panics, I think, obviously, Iran, like a lot of sort of entities at the moment, will be frantically trying to make a calculation. Obviously, drawing the Brits in is a way of escalating the conflict. The Brits would then, of course, be putting pressure on the Americans to stop the fighting and on the Israelis and so on. But equally, the Iranians might judge that it would have the reverse effect, that if you start, creating British casualties, we're just going to say, well, fine, at that point, we're completely supporting America and Israel because you've now killed British servicemen or whatever. So I think that the Iranians are, like everyone else, trying to make really quite difficult calculations about what's in their best interest. But I think that one of the massive questions here is the clear shift in the objective, because at the outset, we're only talking, a small number of days, Israel apparently was going to sort of obliterate the Iranian nuclear program. And it seems to be very clear now that they're now looking to achieve regime change.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
What are, and I asked this of Alex on our main show, what do we think are the real objectives of Israel? I mean, one could say, well, it's to do to the Iranian leadership what they've effectively done to Lebanon's, or maybe more. Or there's the stated objective of reducing their capability to make nuclear weapons. Does it go as far as even saying, actually, we think that the Iranian people have been treated appallingly by the current regime and they deserve a democratically elected government? Forgetting America's objectives, what was in Bibi's head when he does this? Or is it purely, I've got to keep busy so I don't face internal pressure to hold an election?
I think that there's a combination there where, obviously, if you do have this sort of constant need for escalatory activity, then you start by attacking the nuclear program. And then because of what you might call catastrophic success, you start to think, well, I don't want to stop, and maybe I can take down the entire Islamic regime. And if you're Netanyahu, you want to be seen as the historic figure in Israel who liberated Israel from this 40-year or 50-year threat. And of course, let's not forget that prior to 1979, Iran and Israel were close allies. And of course, it was one of its few allies in the region. And so there is that slight sort of nostalgia of an idea that you have this sort of big, powerful imperial state, Iran, allied with Israel, this kind of small, plucky, incredibly well-armed country, and that together that they sort of control the wider region.
Supposing the conflict does lead to a collapse of the current regime, And really, we need to focus on the Iranian people here, many of whom have relatives, friends who have been murdered, beaten, imprisoned, and much more by the current state leadership. Is there an obvious government in waiting? And if so, would they likely offer Iranians a better life, or would they just be a better neighbor to Israel?
That's the big question, isn't it? So you've got, I mean, the short answer is that there isn't a single government in waiting ready. There are various groups. You've got the son of the former Shah, so the royal family, who's been based in America since the revolution, and I would say has fairly limited credibility, although I think perhaps mistakenly within America he's given quite a lot of airtime and is sort of almost seen as a kind of king in exile. There are other groups, there's something called the National Council for Resistance in Iran, which draws together various groups, many of which are fairly sort of far out militant groups. And then the other thing about Iran is you have an ethnic minority. So obviously there's a significant Kurdish minority. There's the Baluchi minority on the border.
It's a very ethnically diverse country.
That's right. Yeah. So you've got these different groups. There's an Arab minority. And most of these groups at different times have been militant and they've enjoyed support from outsiders because outsiders have been seeking to destabilize Iran. But I think the idea that there would be a sort of clear group that would step in, or even, that a group would rapidly coalesce and would be able to take control. I think the risk of a descent into a kind of chaotic and violent civil war, I think, is pretty high.
And history rarely repeats, but it often rhymes. And Western intervention, particularly into Middle Eastern conflict, but wars in general, so often fails to have planned for peaceful regime change and to think about the long-term future and stability in a region that they've been active in bombing. But there is a rumor that Israel and the US have been funding some potential group. I don't know if you know any more than has been reported about what that group is, how likely they are to be the front runner to take power.
So I have looked into that, and certainly over the years, the US has funded various groups. They've tended more to fund sort of militant groups via the CIA that would then blow things up or kind of basically act as a kind of resistance force. It's not clear to me whether or not there's a kind of technocratic, government of national unity type group that could emerge. As you rightly reference sort of previous regime change operations in the region. Speaking as a veteran of the Iraq debacle, I remember, people like Ahmed Chalabi, who the Americans were holding up as, the future leader of Iraq and turned out to be a very insubstantial figure. And there are others that maybe somehow within the Washington Beltway seem like convincing figures, but once you put them in the region, they really don't have the capability or the credibility to lead a complex country.
Well, Arthur, thank you so much for joining us. I desperately hope this isn't going to be appallingly out of date. I don't think it will, because you've given us so much brilliant historical context and flavour of the region and the tensions and bonds that exist prior to all of this. Will you come back with an update for us as and when things emerge and help our listeners understand this delicate situation?
I'd gladly do that. And like everyone else, it's very much hour to hour. So as you say, let's hope this stays relevant.
Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Now, this is an advertisement from BetterHelp. Thanks to them for sponsoring today's show. 1 in 8 men is thought to have a mental health disorder. That's a huge amount of suffering, and much of it goes unnoticed and without help. We live in a pressure cooker world, and it's no secret that bottling things up can lead to depression, burnout and other problems. And while we might be told that it's okay to struggle, the truth is that men in particular still find it difficult to open up about their burdens. If you're a man, and this sounds close to home, then I really can't emphasise how important it is that you reach out to someone you can trust and talk to, whether that's a friend, a loved one or a therapist. My experience with therapy is that it can be the first step towards regaining control of your life, whatever mental health challenges you may be facing. And if you're sceptical or nervous about this approach, I can assure you it's far better than doing nothing, changing nothing, and suffering silently. If you're looking for somewhere to start, then BetterHelp
is the world's largest online therapy platform with more than 5,000 therapists in the UK. You can join a session with a UK therapist and you can switch therapists at any time. Its users rate it highly. BetterHelp has an App Store rating of 4.9 out of 5 based on 1.7 million client reviews. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/quietriot. That's betterhelp.com/quietriot.
9 years ago tomorrow, the UK voted to leave the European Union. And while the fireworks have long since fizzled and coughed out, a new YouGov poll reminds us that the debate itself is far from over. Today, 56% of Brits say Brexit was the wrong decision, which is up slightly from previous years, and 61% judge it more of a failure than a success. Only 31% still believe it was the right move. Most strikingly, perhaps, 65% of the population now support a closer relationship with the EU, and even 56% back rejoining. And that includes a surprising 60% of Leave voters. Let's hope that's significant. Now, the polling captures what appears to be a nation in transition. People don't seem to want to rewind the clock entirely. Only 10% say it's very likely Britain will rejoin within 20 years, and 29% say it's fairly likely. But that doesn't erase people's sense that we rushed something half-baked. A majority want repair, realignment, and pragmatic cooperation. They don't want closure. So, Naomi, 9 years on, in a landscape where the shop window may say post-Brexit forever, public sentiment is telling quite a different story. That almost 2/3 want to dial back the damage. The question now is how politics responds, or indeed how it fails to respond. And I suppose whether the next decade is one of renewal or regret. So, with 56% Naomi saying that Brexit was wrong and 61% calling it a failure, does this indicate a genuine shift in public mood, or is it just a bit of nostalgia?
Oh, it's way more than nostalgia. I think the numbers are just showing us lived experience. We've all known that we've had slower growth, higher cost, and loads of missed opportunities. Life is more difficult for us when we travel. It is more expensive when we go to the supermarket. Brexit hasn't helped anyone take back control.
No, not at all.
No one feels more in control of their life than they did in 2016, except maybe some hedge fund owners. And so I think when 60% of people are telling you that the Brexit project was a failure, that's not wistful. I think it's pragmatic regret that's rooted in their real world impact. And the man who brought us Brexit, in no uncertain terms, Nigel Farage, is riding high in the polls. And so there is a disconnect, and he knows it's been a failure. Now, you've still got some Brexit zealots going, it's failed because of Keir Starmer. And actually within that poll, and we'll leave a link in the show notes to it, there's a list of who do you blame for it. And of course, the Conservatives are up there, Farage is up there.
Yeah.
But Starmer is also on the table. There's, not an insignificant number of people saying it's his fault. And that will be the people that said he's not implemented it properly. He's not gone far enough. That old trope we heard, one last heave, we need a real Brexit, a proper Brexit. Let's go WTO, tear up any kind of trade agreement, just trade on WTO terms with our largest nearest trading partner. But that would be even more costly, inflationary, and depressing on economic growth than the paltry deal that we've got at the moment that I hope the Labour government is going to be able to improve and quickly. And actually, as we're recording this today, the EU is seeking its mandate today, and it I'm assuming will have happened by the time this goes out, to negotiate with the UK on the detail of that youth mobility scheme, which they're now calling a youth experience scheme.
Right. On that topic, and before we dive into the survey figures a little bit more, just in your experience, do you think that the changing demographics of the country, in other words, Brexit voters dying off, is having an impact, or is it too early to see that in the figures yet?
No, we saw it pretty quickly after the referendum. I mean, remember, these aren't figures that have sort of oscillated. It's been a steady regret
Yeah.
since 2016, and the tipping point from majority leave to majority remain happened pretty quickly, actually, or burgeoing, or whatever awful word we want to ascribe to this whole debacle. We are only going to see more of that. Of course, you also get people with age shifting to the right on economic issues, and you can't always expect that, just because somebody was once young and liberal and in favor of free trade, that they'll stick with that throughout their life. But broadly, it wasn't an age thing. When we looked at 2016, it was an education thing.
Right.
And so because younger people tended to have more higher education numbers within their cohort than boomers, that is why it appeared to be a young versus old vote, but it actually wasn't. It was a highly educated versus lower educational attainment divide.
Right. And one of the figures that really leapt out from that summary at the beginning was the fact that 60% of Leave voters favour a closer EU relationship. Come on, and does that mean that Leave is effectively over?
That's really interesting. So what YouGov do really well is they have a great chart that puts a list of options to different voter intention types. So it will ask, should we have a more distant relationship, a closer relationship, about the same relationship as we've got at the moment? Should we rejoin the customs union? Should we rejoin the single market? And they then divide it into Tory, Reform, Green, Lib Dem, Labour, Plaid, SNP, other. And on every single question, it's quite divided either side of the 50-50 line,
Right.
with the right-wing voting intention respondents on the do not rejoin the single market, do not rejoin the customs union, and the Lib Dem, Labour, SNP, Plaid voters up the other end. But when you ask that first question about should we have a closer relationship, but stop short of rejoining the institutions of the EU, they bunch together. So the only place where there is consistency and you can build broad coalition of support is when you say the current situation is terrible. We need a closer relationship, but we're not going to go as far as rejoining things. And that is exactly what the Labour Party are doing. That is what is in their manifesto and is what they've sought to negotiate at the summit and hopefully at the annual summits as they go on. Now, of course, that might change and you might see that group sticking all together and going further towards rejoining things like the customs union. But at the moment, you've got this sweet spot, which is pretty much in line with what the government is doing. And that's really without any major figurehead in British politics talking up freedom of movement, talking up the single market, talking up customs union. Honourable exception to the Liberal Democrat individual MPs who do occasionally mention it. But in the way Farage really led the Eurosceptic campaign for years and years and years, decades, in fact, there really hasn't been that on the other side. So I think it is really significant to see so much consensus around a closer relationship across voting intention without anybody really championing it.
Yeah. I mean, something I'd like to ask you, just pick your brains on this. When Brexit happened, the great and the good said, look, it's going to be 10 years. It's going to be probably 2030, if not longer, before we start to see meaningful change and before the country is going to be ready to revisit the scene of the accident, as it were.
Yeah.
Is there anything actually surprising about these figures, or is this kind of a natural progression that we're seeing and it's something that we were all sort of expecting once we pushed the button to get out of Europe?
If you take 1975 as the year zero, the year we voted to stay in the EEC, it took the best part of 40 years to convince enough people that we needed to leave the EU. So one could say, all right, well, if it took 40 years to leave it, it might take 40 years to join it. I don't think it will take that long at all. But we are a decade on nearly now from that moment. although we're not technically a decade on from the moment that we actually left and began to feel the real pain of the friction at the border and the increased costs. So I think we're probably about where you might have expected people to be. I think we might even be further along had we not had the pandemic and multiple geopolitical crises to blame for inflation and rising costs and energy bills and things like that. And that may have all come a little bit sooner by a couple of years if we hadn't. But I'd say we're probably on course.
That's, I mean, so some grounds for optimism, or at least grounds to not be too depressed about where we are. And in fact, that's reflected in these figures as well this week. I mean, most of the respondents to the YouGov poll support some form of re-engagement.
Yeah.
But only 39% believe that we'll rejoin within 20 years. So what does that gap tell us?
I mean, look, the gap between desire and expectation can speak volumes, and without doing follow-up polling and probably some qualitative, it's going to be really hard to know.
Yeah.
But I think overall it's saying people want it, but they just don't think it's politically feasible. Oh, it's really interesting. We sort of see this in polling quite a bit, actually, Kenny, where you'll ask somebody something like, say, do you support new housing development in your local area? And they'll go, yes. And you say, do you think your neighbours will support it? And they go, no, they'll be really NIMBY about it. And then you'll go next door and ask them and they'll be like, no, I'm really for it. So there is a problem in polling that we tend to think, doom and gloom, the people all around me are so awful at holding us back from progress. And actually, it's not true. So I do think that within this gap between desire and expectations, people do want it. They just don't think it's politically feasible because perhaps they don't fully understand how far their leave voting relative or neighbour or whatever has come on the issue. But I think, we can clearly see significant public pressure is building. And it's the politicians who are lagging behind because they lack the courage to steer the ship in the right direction over the channel.
I mean, a majority across the parties now want closer ties with the EU. What should that mean for Labour, for the Conservatives, and I suppose for Reform UK as well?
Well, for Labour, it's a green light to press ahead with pragmatic alignment, aligning with EU standards and regulations so that we can export our product and buy from them without trade friction at the border. I mean, it's a madness, it's a nonsense. Economic reality is that you have a gravity force within trade, and geography means that we are bound to them in a way we can never be to other countries around the world. So on trade, on youth mobility, on research, on all these things, this polling says government keep going and go further. Right. The Conservatives are just now looking out of step with their own voters. They are looking out of step with Leave voters, and they are becoming such a political insignificance at the moment. And for Reform, well, I think they know all of this. They don't really talk about Brexit that much anymore. And very occasionally Farage pops up and says something, but they've moved on to immigration. That's the new bogeyman. And that's what you've got to remember about populists, is as soon as the thing that they think is popular no longer is, they move on to the next thing.
Absolutely.
And they're not rooted in any kind of moral values whatsoever.
And one last question on this topic. Did the findings reflect what you've been hearing from your supporters at Best for Britain?
It certainly reflects a lot of our own polling. Remember, we poll much bigger samples than this with YouGov on a very regular basis. And we've known for a really long time that the public is, on the whole, way ahead of the Labour strategy. Before the summit, when we did a lot of constituency level polling around it, we were seeing voters telling us that they want the government to be much more ambitious than their stated plans and red lines are at the moment. So if anything, I'd say voters are probably even more enthusiastic than this particular poll that we didn't commission, but YouGov has done, picks up.
Oh, hooray. That's good news to hear on a Sunday. Thank you for that, Naomi.
If you've shopped online, chances are you've bought from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes it incredibly easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/promo. Go to shopify.com/promo.
Kenny, let's turn now to the ongoing story of UK university stress. We've done a couple of shows on this before, but this week we've had two kind of big bits of news, from a 35 million black hole at Dundee University to a really sharp slide down the global league tables for the UK university sector as a whole. So at Dundee, as I understand it, the fallout is pretty immediate and dramatic. The head honchos have resigned overnight after an ugly Gillies review revealed poor financial judgment, inadequate management and reporting, lack of agility, all around a £35 million deficit. It's causing job cuts. It's triggering a 22 million bailout from the Scottish Funding Council. But these budget breaches aren't isolated, and it feels like they're forming part of a much broader systemic squeeze on higher education. This week, the World University Rankings are a pretty damning confirmation of that squeeze. 60% of UK unis have fallen in the latest global rankings, including nearly half of the elite Russell Group. Sun-kissed institutions like Edinburgh dropped 7 points. LSE slipped out of the top 50 completely. Even Oxford and Cambridge took hits, though Imperial College London remains ahead of them in global second place, just behind MIT in the US. So UK higher education, it's clearly suffering from more than just one-off mismanagement. It's dealing with deep structural issues, funding squeezes, shrinking international student numbers, visa caps, cost of inflation, all are draining resources rapidly. So the question is whether we think this is a kind of medium-term stumble or some kind of like irreversible decline. So Kenny, you're a Scot. Do the immediate triggers, like we're seeing in Dundee, reflect what's happening elsewhere, or is this something that if they just had good governance wouldn't have happened there?
Well, the answer, I think, is yes on both points, because Dundee had some very particular problems.
Go on, tell us.
Centred on its leadership. The independent report into what happened in Dundee was utterly coruscating about leadership at the university. Professor Ian Gillespie, who got the biggest kicking, he was the big cheese in Dundee up till just before Christmas when he resigned in disgrace. Now, he was accused of essentially misogyny. You know, the accusations were quite clear. He didn't like being challenged. He was quite bullying in his approach. He shut down any sort of dissent. He was a problematic individual from a managerial perspective. So let's sort of plant that as one of the issues that Dundee faced. You know, and up until 3 years ago, Dundee was doing quite okay. Then they got hit by a drop in overseas student numbers. That left them with a black hole. And instead of addressing the black hole, they kind of went, no, everything's okay. Problems got worse. And anybody that tried to challenge the big cheese found themselves ignored effectively. So on the one side in Dundee, you've got local issues that will be familiar to anybody who's sort of grown up in a corporate world. You still come across individuals who behave in an unacceptable way now and again. It's worth noting, by the way, that the fact that misogyny was one of the issues around leadership there is particularly unfortunate, because Dundee University historically has blazed a trail for women's rights.
No.
It was founded back in, I think it was about 1881. It was around about that time. And explicitly, it was trying to provide equal opportunity education, regardless of your sex, regardless of your religion. And I believe it was the first university in the UK that educated men and women side by side. I know the University of London was the first UK university to award degrees to women on equal terms with men. But I think Dundee, it certainly was one of the first. It may well have been the first to provide equal opportunity education. So it's a particularly unpleasant and unfortunate stain on its history and what's happened here. Now, that's Dundee-centric stuff. There are much bigger issues at play here as well. I mentioned the fact that a slump in overseas students left them, I think, £8 million short. That's not an issue that's
Unique to
to
them,
Dundee.
no, not
And the
at all.
report itself made it quite clear that the pressures that Dundee was facing were not unique to Dundee either. There were sector-wide problems that were being faced by everybody, and so Dundee couldn't get off the hook simply because it was having a particularly tough time. So, I mean, to your question, do they reflect deeper structural issues across higher education in the country? Yes, that issue around how much we rely upon the income that foreign students bring is very, very significant. And if you start to take meaningful chunks out of that, then universities will, and indeed are, struggling financially. There was a survey done by, and they
University of the
asked,
UK?
yes, they asked just a couple of months ago, universities, I think 60 or so universities, how are the financial pressures increasing? And half of all the respondents, half of all the universities that they surveyed had already closed courses to cut costs.
Yeah.
And course consolidation had gone through the ceiling. Almost half of all the institutions had cut things like optional modules. And 18% of them, this is a very scary one, 18% of those universities surveyed had already closed entire departments.
It is bloody depressing given what an enormous export university education in the UK is, and this doesn't just affect students, international students, our ability to put on great courses. We are also talking about research, and the research is what ranks the universities in this QS rankings slump that we've got now. So does a fall in ranking practically matter for things like research quality and economic spillovers, or is it, a bit like a school league table that, oh, who cares if you go up or down a couple each year? It doesn't really matter.
Rankings may not be everything, but it's definitely not the case that they're nothing either. For international students, and those are the ones who pay the bills, they are often, and why wouldn't they be, the first thing that they check? They're also the first thing that their families check if their families are paying for them to come over here. So a university falling out of the top 50 can mean literally millions of pounds in lost tuition fees. It also means a lot of lost prestige. That's important. And that feeds into a loss of talent as well. Academics move on to more prestigious posts in more prestigious universities, and students follow them. So when you see that 60% of UK universities are on the slide in this particular table, that really is a red flag fluttering over the entire sector.
It must be, because I know that, I do a lot of work in investment and getting investment into regions, and obviously this is all linked to foreign trade, and that's why I've got skin in that game. And it is not uncommon for a city region or a Greater Manchester Authority or something like that to say, right, we're going to take the football club, we're going to take a couple of the famous players, we're going to take the university vice chancellors, we're going to take a few leading employers from the region, a few politicians, and we're going to go out together to Singapore, Hong Kong, Delhi, Johannesburg, like whatever, Saudi Arabia, and we're going to sell our region and everything that makes it so brilliant, and why they should come and put steel in the ground and set up a new plant in our area, or do a link up between their university and ours, or whatever it is. And universities play such a critical role in that. And I often draw a parallel with Doncaster, because to me that is a town with incredible infrastructure but no university.
Right.
That shows me that infrastructure is necessary but insufficient. It's got the A1M, it's not far from the M1, it's got really fast rail links to London by comparison to other places as many miles away from London as it is. It's actually got a little airport, it's not far from some other airports. It's got the ingredients that on paper you should think would make it a really great destination for foreign investment.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. Why? Because there's no higher education there. There's no big research facilities. There's not that sort of virtuous circle of research into business back into research going on there, and that knowledge transfer that hubs kind of create and have that great multiplier effect on an area. So I think this is incredibly worrying. I mean, the rankings are done based on citations in research papers. So if your university has managed to get X number of papers published in a peer-reviewed journal, it gets points to go up a ranking.
That's right.
And so what this is telling us is that the quality of research, or the volume, I don't know, maybe it's just that they're not submitting as many papers, or maybe they are submitting the same number and they're not getting published. I mean, that is really damning.
It is, and this particular survey also includes data like employer surveys. So they're looking at the outputs and the real-world impact of the education. They're not just looking at the traditional ivory tower stuff. They're looking at how the ivory tower stuff improves or fails to improve the world around it. I think there's another point. I mean, the point you make about Doncaster is a fascinating one, actually. A city like Doncaster without a higher education establishment, its demographics are going to be markedly different.
Yeah.
It's not just a British challenge. The findings do reflect a much wider trend. Places like Canada and Australia are struggling to compete in a higher education arms race with the really well-funded universities in places like China. India's not far behind now either, and Southeast Asia. Only Britain and the United States have got more universities in the ranking than China does. So it's coming up, and we know what's going to happen with China. It's on that upward curve, and it will go past us at some point.
Of course, yeah. So how do you think policymakers should be responding on all of this? Is it a throw money at it thing? Is it reforming how they're regulated? Is it structural consolidation and just have fewer universities?
Well, it's not a PR problem, is it? You know, this is this is not how we perceive the university world. These are real world issues that are affecting countries around the globe. There are winners and there are losers, and it's not something that a bit of slick marketing alone is likely to solve. It's too big a set of problems for that. It would be smart, it would be wonderful if if the planners started to treat universities and that sector more like the economic engines that they really are. You know, there are serious economic and societal benefits, we all know, from having these institutions and from having them at the top of their game. Now, some structural reform is probably needed. You know, some universities are much more forward-thinking than others. We all know that. But if the answer is fewer universities, fewer courses, more centralized control, that's not really reform. That is managed decline. And that's something we should be very, very concerned about, particularly given what we're seeing growth-wise in places like China, places like Southeast Asia, and watch over the next 10 years, places like India. What we really need is a proper grown-up funding settlement that recognizes the economic benefits, the societal benefits, the fact that we're all better off as individuals and as a society when we've got these universities firing on all cylinders. What we don't need is some sort of half-arsed fire sale.
Yeah. And so if you were Chancellor then, what's your priority? Are you going to try and stabilize the finances, protecting critical areas like STEM while letting art slide? Like what would be your focus?
You know I'm going to say this, but you can't really just pick one. They're all messed up like a bowl of spaghetti. They all influence one or another. But if you twisted my arm, I think given what we've seen, you know, let's head back to Dundee to see what prompted the real financial problems up there. Apart from mismanagement, it was a lack of stability in their finances. Without financial stability, you can't really do any of the rest. It stands to reason, doesn't it? It's really hard to lead the world in science or to widen access when what you're doing at home is just laying off staff, shuttering libraries, closing courses, and doing all the bad stuff that we've been hearing about over the last 3-4 years.
Well, as the daughter of a former vice-chancellor and a university lecturer, my God, I hope we turn this round and save them. And let's hope that that youth mobility scheme we were talking about earlier does something to help boost international student numbers in both directions. And wouldn't it be great if our students got even more opportunity to study abroad too? But I think we should probably wrap it up there, Kenny.
Yep, that is it for today, folks. I'm afraid we hope that you enjoyed the show as ever. As the resident non-Londoner, that's a big catch-all, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or have we got an M25-centric view? Well, Kenny is the resident non-Londoner. But I do feel it's incumbent on me to remind you to go have a listen to the special episode on Wales that we dropped on Friday. It's really very good if you haven't done so already. Will Hayward joined Naomi to chat about the trends to keep an eye on over the next year in the run-up to the Senedd elections.
Oh, diolch, Kenny.
No.
We need to do a Scottish standalone episode too, not just Dundee. We've got to go further north, further west. We've got to cover the whole country. So we will bring you something on that very, very soon. But Kenny, thank you for joining me today on Sunday School. This was a treat.
My pleasure, my genuine pleasure. Now I have a chance to calm down from all my movements up and down the country.
Go and have a cold shower.
It's going to be a cold beer, I can tell you right now. We will be, assuming I don't melt, we'll be back on Thursday with the main show. And we're delighted to have Ellie Chowns MP coming into the studio. She's running to be co-leader of the Green Party.
Very exciting. Well, until then, everybody, enjoy your weekend. Remember how much we adore you. And thank you for giving us your time. Bye. Are you sweating comfortably?
I'm just soaking. It's disgusting.
Just slot it in.